In this video, I'm going to give you the ultimate guide to the Loomis method. We're going to go in depth, in detail. I'm going to go through what this is, why it is a really useful system, but more importantly, how you can use it in your day-to-day artistic life. Because what I found over 25 years as a professional artist and over 10 years teaching professionally as well, is that while I use the Loomis method frequently in my comic books, in concept design, to design weird creatures, interesting characters, be able to draw them from different angles, and when I'm drawing comic books, to create characters that are consistently looking the same from all sorts of different angles as well. A lot of people aren't getting the most out of this simple system, and this may be you. You may have already watched some tutorials on the Loomis method, you may understand the basic concept here, and you may also have some decent facial anatomy knowledge as well. But that often doesn't translate into being able to use it and being comfortable and, as I said, getting the most out of it. So we're going to go over the basics. I'm going to do some demos. I'm going to show you how I use this, but we're also going to look at the common traps and pitfalls and problems that people run into, as well as going deep on what this is actually going to give you. Because the reality is this isn't going to teach you facial anatomy. It's not some magical system, but it's a really good way to block out the face and deploy the anatomy knowledge that you already have and design interesting characters and draw them from lots and lots of different angles. So we're going to go over things such as how much to actually chop off the sides of the ball or sphere in the beginning and how that actually works in perspective. And I'm going to give you some tips and tricks of how I use this professionally, and we'll do a bunch of demos. So this is going to be in-depth. It is a long video. It is fully narrated, real time, but I think that's what we need for you to actually understand how this can help your drawing. And hopefully by the end of this, you'll understand what this is all about, why it's really cool, and you have a really good understanding of how it's going to help you create much, much more interesting characters that look consistent from different angles. Anyway, if that sounds fun, let's jump in and get started. Alright, welcome to the Drawing Codex. My name is Tim McBurney. I have been a professional working artist for over 20 years, and on this channel we're all about drawing cool stuff from our imagination, embracing the challenge of drawing, and mastering the craft of line and color illustration. Let's dive in. Now, in a second we'll look at what the original version of the Loomis method is as defined by Loomis himself in Drawing the Head and Hands, but what I'm going to do over the course of this video is firstly, look at how this actually works in practice. So we'll go through some drawings and I'll do a demo of how the basic Loomis method functions. But then I'm going to look at what this actually gives us, like what are the benefits of this, like why does this exist? And then I'll look at what it doesn't give you, like explicitly what this is not going to help you with, that if you are imagining like this is how it's going to help you, it's probably not. Then I'm going to look at how to properly construct the ball in perspective, which is a fundamental thing that a lot of people get wrong and struggle with. And then I'll look at how to basically deal with the thing that most people want, which is how do you draw this from different angles? So the number one challenge that people often have is like, look, I can draw a face from the front. How do I draw it from below or above? And how do I make that look consistent? And this is one of the things that the Loomis method really helps us with. Then I'm going to look at something that I think is really critical, which is the anatomy gap. And this is understanding a little bit of what the Loomis doesn't give us, which is anatomy knowledge, right? It's there to help us block in primary forms. After that, we'll look at how to actually block in some of the features on top of the Loomis method construction. And then lastly, I'll do a proper demo, sort of showing you how we then actually kind of draw a proper face on top of that, right? So we're not just drawing weird kind of sketchy anatomy people. And yeah, as a bonus thing at the end, I'll give you a couple of tips and tricks, some pro little things that I do as a professional artist, and I'll look at kind of how you can actually use it day to day in your artistic practice. But firstly, let's have a look at what the Loomis method actually is. So this is from Andrew Loomis's Drawing the Head and Hands, and this is actually an idea that Loomis has had in most of the books that he's created, the idea of starting with a sphere, but it's probably best expressed in this book. And this is the basic concept, and you've probably seen this before. What we're essentially doing is taking a sphere, we are defining dimensionality within the sphere, because again, a sphere is just a circle until you figure out like where it is sitting in space. which is one of the big challenges here. And he's trying to describe that, yeah, a good way to approximate the skull and then to create the jaw and the actual kind of facial mask is to just take a sphere, chop a little bit off the side, and then draw a line down the center, and sort of define this cross, where we get the brow crossing in the center of the sphere. And again, it's really quite an elegant little solution, especially when you want to draw the same face from different angles. So this is the basic idea that he's sort of describing. And here you can see the real key to this is in the cross. And it's understanding that if you think of a sphere, it's easy to rotate a sphere. And if you define a key anatomical marker, which is the division of the center line of the face and the line across the brow, you kind of get a huge amount of information just from doing that. So if you just take a sphere, you chop a bit off the side, you define where the center is, right between the eyebrows, right? You do that, and all of a sudden, like magically, a lot of the drawing of the head is solved. So that's like a fundamental part of this. Now, something that you kind of notice, and something that's worth pointing out, is there's two things here. One is we just kind of magically start putting in some temple rhythms, cheekbones, some of the eye socket material, and we're also often just casually kind of placing in all the anatomy, right? So this is often where people get kind of trapped is they're like, okay, I got the sphere and I'm getting it more and more accurate. Like, okay, what comes next and how do I sort of figure this out? The other thing is like how much do you chop off the side and what looks better and what looks good. And what you'll actually see here is like the difference that the amount that he's chopping off here and here and here is different, right? Like, and the angle of this is different. So just to understand, like, this is a general idea. It's a very broad strokes concept. We'll look at how to think about how much to measure there, but just to understand that this is a really good idea, but it lacks a lot of fidelity. Some of that fidelity is filled in as we sort of get to looking at adding more of this sort of detail. And here you can see how he's talking about, yeah, like stick with the cross, add in some of these cheekbones, which I find really, really useful. And that, yeah, if you sort of do that, then you can define cheekbones, brow, temple, a bit of the barrel of the mouth, some of that dental arch. And that, like, this gives you so much more information. But the challenge is, like, if you don't know where all this stuff is, it's really hard to sort of add it. So that's a bit of what we'll sort of go over. And here you can see, again, like a full construction and breakdown of sort of what he's talking about. A lot of this stuff is covered in the text, but often when you sort of watch a YouTube tutorial on this that's a little bit shorter, it's really hard to go over all this information in one go, right, and really explain it. So in this video, my goal is to go over and explain a lot of what is happening here in terms of the anatomy, why we break this down into 1, 2, 3, 4 lines, why are there 3 equal proportions in the face, how is this important when we know that not all faces break down into these 3 equal proportions. This is very much sort of a Western classical ideal, and again, let's go into this all in major detail, and I'll break it down for you. We'll look at how the basic Loomis method functions, and then deal with all the kind of stuff that normally comes up, so that at the end of this, you have a really solid idea of how this functions, but more importantly, how it fits into your process. So next up, we're going to look at how this actually works in practice, and I'll walk you through why we have 3 equal proportions and how it's actually a really, really elegant way to block in your faces. So the Loomis method works by creating these spheres. And firstly, we can just look at this at the most basic level, where we're trying to define dimensionality within the sphere. Now, the trick is, like, how do we actually do this? And how do we progress through these steps? And we'll dive into some of these as we go through the video. But the initial concept is pretty simple. We have a sphere, and then we define dimensionality within the sphere by essentially drawing lines that are contour lines around the sphere. You can think of this as if it's a bowl, right? And we're just sort of drawing these, right? If this was sort of a beach bowl, right? You're trying to do this. Now, there's a couple of challenges here. Like one of the challenges here is that this actually requires quite a bit of perspective knowledge, as does actually placing and thinking about how this ellipse that we're chopping off the side actually functions. And again, I'll unpack that as we go in a later section. But what we're doing next is actually defining some proportional markers of the face, or we can think about as this is like the mask of the face, like the actual features. What the Loomis method does is it fundamentally gives us a good primary form breakdown of the face, the cheekbones, so we have the front of the face, the side of the face, and just the skull mass at the back, or the brain casing. And his observation is really simple, is that by finding the center line, or the little cross of the sphere, we actually get this point, which is just smack bang in the middle of the eyebrows. Now, what we next do is define 3 equal proportions, and I'll talk about in a little bit why there are 3 equal proportions, and why, even though that's not true in terms of all faces, it's a good place to start. But we're really thinking about, and this is a lot easier, and also why it becomes tricky once you draw this from different angles. In the beginning, we're kind of imagining that we have like a hairline somewhere around here. And this gives us the first proportion. The first line and the second line and the first proportion, right? The top or forehead. And the second one is basically where we take the same proportion of the forehead, but we sort of duplicate it down. So the second proportion that we normally get is going to be this, but just duplicated down. Now I'm viewing this from slightly below, so there's a bit of perspective involved already. But this is the basic idea. And then right, we have our second proportion, which is nose and eyes. And then we just take that same vertical measurement again, and we have our mouth. Right, so there's 1, 2, 3, 4 lines and 3 major proportional markers that we use. Now, what this does is it gives us our chin, it gives us the start of the nose, it gives us the brow line, and this actually gives us quite a few markers here that allow us to draw the face. We're also kind of saying that, hey, if you chop the side of this sphere off, it gives us a good approximation of the skull. Again, not perfect, because the skull is going to probably dip in a little bit more than what we're cutting off. And it's also going to probably go out a little bit more than we're cutting off at the back. So it's kind of an approximation, or what we define as like a primary form breakdown, i.e. it's a good place to start, but it's not where we end up. But what I can do is kind of say, well, now that I sort of have divided that in half, then I can probably draw a line halfway down it, right? Sort of in the center there. And that's going to be pretty close to where this jawline is going to be, right? Like pretty close. And then if I think about, well, halfway up that mouth proportion is probably going to be about where the line of the mouth is going to be. I like to define the mound of the mouth and think about where the center line is. And yeah, probably we're going to have the jaw change direction somewhere around there, right? A little bit below, a little bit above, depending on male, female, or masculine, feminine markers. But yeah, that's a pretty good indication. So I sort of start to get a couple of indications here. I'm also, this is something we'll sort of dive into, and something you'll see Loomis kind of does, is we're actually like kind of taking almost like an equal line here and sort of drawing another ellipse around, right? So we got our one where we chop the side off, and then we're kind of saying, hey, there's actually another one the other side, and that would be mirrored on the side over here. And this actually defines kind of where the temple rhythm is. So we can think of the skull. Here I have, right, the temple line, and that gives us a pretty good indication, because again, the temple in the forehead is very close in, much more so than the side of the face or the skull. So just by putting in a couple of these proportions, I've now got like a pretty good structural breakdown. And this really is all we need. Now, there are some other marks that you see that Loomis puts in. One of the things he's often doing is putting in these cheekbones. So these are critical markers as they define where the actual anatomy of the face is. But if you don't understand the anatomy, you're kind of just following along blindly. So this is where we start to diverge from the typical Loomis breakdown, which is like, hey, if you chop a bit off the side of a sphere and then you draw a line down, then this will give you, right, like a pretty good block in for a face. And then you're kind of good to go. So again, that's the typical Loomis proportional breakdown for the Loomis method. In order to actually draw a face out of that, though, you need to think about these other markers. So this is where we often want to define the temple rhythm and where the cheekbones are. We also often want to define where the nose is. We know where the nose is going to stop. Right, so we're going to put in, right, the primary form of the nose there, and then all these other bits and pieces. But again, understand that we've kind of moved off the simple Loomis method structure here, and we're starting to add anatomy. But this is exactly what Loomis is kind of suggesting that you do. And obviously, once we've got these markers, then I know, well, yeah, like my ear lives in this middle proportion. The ear lives between the bottom of the nose and the top of the brow, right? So I can kind of trace this round because I know where these proportions are, and then I can easily put in my ear, right? And I can add a bit more of a realistic dimension to the skull, right? I can think about where that starts and stops. And this gives me a really nice indication now of where a lot of these different markers are going to be. And once I've got that, then a lot of the work's done. Now I can think much more about drawing all the features that I think are going to be cool, thinking about where the eyes go, and applying all of that other extra facial anatomy and proportional markers that I understand, right? Can think about placing the lips, right? I can think about the extra rhythms of the face. I can think about where those tear ducts normally are. I can think about fleshing out and defining a bit more about the actual kind of brow size. I can think more clearly about where the actual, right, like where's this skull going to be underneath there? Where is the zygomatic bone? Right, all of this stuff that might be useful, like now becomes a lot more possible. And I can also then start to employ a lot of other drawing systems. So once I kind of have a good understanding of where this basic proportion is, then it's a lot easier for me to apply some simple Riley or Frank Riley-esque rhythms to think about putting in some eyes, right, etc., etc., etc. So the real beauty of this is that it gets me really quickly from 0 to facial proportion. But this is the basic idea that we're working with. And it'll do a really good job of just understanding where all of these things need to go. So let's look at why this works and why this is so important. Because again, I think that's part of the puzzle here. So why three proportions, and how does this kind of work? Well, firstly, you can see that there is like a pretty good proportional breakup, and it is good to record and think of the different facial proportions in terms of these three sections. Again, we do have above the eyebrows to the hairline, or where the hairline would be. Again, some people have different hairlines, some people have no hairline. It's completely different. Everyone is weird and interesting and beautiful in their own way. And why are we looking at these equal proportions? It's good to look at these as being separate proportions. And often, if you're designing a particular character, you may exaggerate one or make the forehead larger or smaller or whatever. But the reason that we teach these three basic proportions, right, three basic proportions, is that this is how anatomy was traditionally taught and learned. And this comes from thousands of years ago, millennia ago, where you had ancient Greek sculptors like the classic Polykleitos basically saying, you know what? You know what, guys? You know what looks really good? And he was all about what looks good. Like, he was sitting there going, like, what is the perfect human form? Because people were, like, if you could sculpt a perfect human form, that's pretty cool, right? Like, that's a pretty cool thing to do, because that maybe wouldn't exist 2,500 years ago. But if you can think about what the best proportions are, what he basically said is like, yeah, three equal proportions from the hairline, basically like where the hair is. And we can think of this as like, yeah, like this is not about structure. It's not about anatomy. It's not about the skull. It's purely about human perceived beauty by sculptors in Greece thousands of years ago. And it's really looking at the visual proportions that we see. The first proportion being from the hair line, right, where you'd kind of see the hairline and having the forehead, and then being like, okay, an equal proportion then for the nose. That looks good, right? So we kind of got 1, 2, and then what looks good is equal, right? Like 3 equal proportions. And this is defined in that kind of classical tradition. Now, the reason that I guess this is taught is because it's good to have a baseline. So it's great to have something that we can all learn as a set of proportions. And because a lot of the art educational stuff that we have traces back to the Renaissance, people were really into both classical beauty and also the ideals from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. So if you've seen the Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, right, where he kind of has, right, these different, you've kind of probably seen this thing, the Vitruvian Man. This is based on the Roman architect Vitruvius. And Vitruvius also said, like Polykleitos, you know what's actually good? Polykleitos had a great idea. 3 equal proportions is the divine beauty. It's the equal proportion. These are the same people who are into Fibonacci spirals and golden ratios and all that kind of stuff. Da Vinci was into that. And yeah, he said that works for architecture too. So probably you want, all your Roman pillars and your different architectural things. Like, let's divide them into 3 equal proportions, right? It looks good. It works. It's a good rule of thumb. So everyone who was committing a lot of anatomy texts to knowledge, to paper, and a lot of the guilds and ateliers and academies basically followed this same system because A, it's good, B, it does look good, and C, they kind of really liked the classic period. So everything we kind of know from those classic French and Italian ateliers and academies is based on this simple proportional set. And as you probably know, we had people like Bridgman and other American artists went and studied at those academies and learned those things, brought them back to America, And then that's how it got passed on to people like Loomis and Riley, etc., who created a lot of the proportional stuff we see. So that's why we have 1, 2, 3 equal proportions. And why is this good? Well, firstly, it's easy to remember, right? Like, it's really easy to remember. Second, look, it's not far off a lot of classic Western anatomy. And it also means that you can test your skills against this simple set of proportions, and you're going to see very similar advice that has been given for hundreds, if not thousands of years. But it's obviously not really all there is. So there are many other much, much more interesting facial proportions out there. And, Loomis is just one because it draws from the Western academic tradition of anatomy and those sort of golden proportional ratios. So that's why what we're trying to do, and what Loomis is obviously trying to do, is say, like, hey, how do I find a sphere? How do I find a form, a primary form that represents the mass of the skull and then the face and the mask of the face, and also allows me to easily give us 3 proportions? And so what he found is, yeah, if you take a sphere and you just kind of find the center of it, and you kind of say, look, that's here, and then you kind of, from there, can kind of find those 2 separate equal proportions going up to the hairline and down to the nose. And then if you just duplicate one of those, you kind of get like a pretty good indication of that mass there. And if you chop the side off it, then all of a sudden you've got like a pretty good indication of that overall mass. And that really is what the Loomis method is about. It's just someone sitting there figuring it out and being like, hey, you know what? This makes this really easy, right? And if you just keep doing that, you can kind of draw the head from any angle, and you can think about it from any angle. And this is what allows us to, with a bit of guesstimation from perspective, which again we'll dive into, because it's critical to understand that it's easy to do it here when we can measure these, but it's trickier to do it when we have to measure in 3 dimensions. But the real key and the real reason why, hey, like, you could probably draw a face from front on and from 3/4 and get that pretty consistent, but when you have to draw the face from the side and 3/4 and from different angles, what's great about the Loomis method is that it gives us the back of the skull and the mass of the skull. And so a lot of the major problems that people would typically face when they're drawing anatomy is that we often don't add enough mass to the back of the skull. Like, we don't get this bit right. And so as a result, typically what happens is that the whole thing feels a little bit off. And so frequently one of the mistakes that artists will make is that they just kind of draw the face. So we just kind of focus on this, and we don't give us enough room at the back of the skull. And so often what happens is, yeah, you don't get any of this space where, like, anatomically you need to connect these sort of neck muscles to, right? Then we don't have the space at the back to put the hair. And so things just often look a little bit off if you don't get the back of the skull and understanding how to represent that in 3 dimensions. So it's really useful to be able to do that. And this is what allows us to do these kind of much more, yeah, like now I'm looking down. So I've got that proportion, right? I've got my hairline up here now, right? I've got the brow line. And maybe here again, I'll just sort of put in a rough indication, because again, here I'm guesstimating. So we'll dive into some of this, again, as I said, in some follow-up sections in a minute, as we sort of dive into this in more detail. But yeah, this is what allows us to say, hey, let's put a nose in this central proportion, right? Here we would have our kind of eyes, right? Here I got my forehead lines, right? Here I'm going to have my cheekbone, and here somewhere between the bottom of the nose and the bottom of the chin I'm going to have my kind of mound of the mouth and my jaw. Right here I'm going to have the chin, and yeah, if I kind of chop the sides off, right, like now I've actually got a pretty good, right, if I can, I'm filling in the gaps here. And this is the trick is, yeah, I'm kind of filling in the gaps based on some anatomical knowledge and where the jaw would go, and I'm visualizing that in 3 dimensions. And the Loomis method kind of will and won't give you some of that information. But here, just very easily, I can kind of rough in what a face might look like from above, right? And this is normally like a very sort of challenging, right, angle to get right because we got a lot of foreshortening. So the real benefit of the Loomis method is not, can you draw a three-quarter view? Can you draw a front view? It's, let's make sure that the three-quarter view, the front view, and the side view are all the same. Let's measure the proportion and then understand that once we do that, it's a lot easier to draw those same proportions from different angles. Not easy, not simple, it's not solved, but it solves the fundamental problem, which is like, how do I block this in? How do I make it work in the most basic sense? So again, hopefully that's been interesting. This is the first little section here, how the Loomis method works, what it's all about. We're going to dive into this in way more detail as we progress, but the thing I want to touch on next is really critical, because if you don't understand this, then you can actually do the Loomis method and still be kind of encountering a lot of friction. And that is like, what does this actually give us? Like, what is the actual benefit for this? How does this actually kind of help us? And what doesn't it do? Like, what is this not going to do for you? And where do you need to fill in your anatomical knowledge or your proportional knowledge or your perspective knowledge or your form drawing knowledge? Like, where exactly does this fit into your skill tree, your skill stack, and how do you get the most out of it? And again, after that, I'll dive into some more demos and things, but I think this is the most critical thing to understand right now. What is the Loomis method actually for? Why is this so useful? Like, what does this actually give you? If you learnt the Loomis method perfectly, how would it improve what you're doing? The way that I find this really useful is that it allows me to draw from imagination a particular character from an infinite number of angles. And this really is the benefit. So Loomis is actually giving us this proportional way of constructing the figure primarily as a way to draw from imagination, which is what I do. This is what I care about, is like drawing comic books, concept art, all these things from imagination. And it's really powerful because it gives you a way to break down and construct the primary form of the face. It gives you a way to think about the different proportions. And then what you can actually do is change those proportions. So the real trick is like, yes, it's good to learn the basic proportions, the 2,500-year-old Greek traditional divine proportions of the human face. But that's not all faces, and faces are far more interesting than that, far more varied. So all you have to do is basically just go, well, if I make the middle proportion smaller or bigger, or if I change this or I change that, you can just record that as a particular proportion in your mind and say, hey, like this character has a really big nose, right? This character has much wider eyes. This character has a really big forehead. This character has a really small forehead, right? This character has a really large mound of the mouth, right? Like dental arch, larger lips. And because we're learning to record proportion and then repeat that and do it from different angles, it just gives you a nice sequence with which to build that. And so what you tend to find is that if you really master this technique, it allows you to quickly block in different characters and make sure that they look consistent across different views. So I really like this for drawing comic books, obviously, because some of the characters that I have different faces, and I can just sort of record and be like, oh no, like this character has a really long face, this character's got, like really big cheekbones. And I'm just sort of recording that as a set of proportions variated off that standard set of Loomis proportions. And then I just sort of brainlessly block it in the same way. And then I'm just like, oh, this chin's a little bit bigger, this nose a little bit smaller, or whatever. And if you do this again and again and again, hundreds and hundreds of times, it's just a really reliable, simple system for doing this. The other way that this is really going to help you is it just allows you to quickly block in where the head is. And so often what you have is if you're actually creating an illustration, you can just kind of play with the head and be like, oh, I'm going to draw the sphere first. So you kind of place the main mass of the head on the torso, and then you can kind of just rotate it by kind of just changing where the circle on the side and the actual kind of point between the eyes is. So it's a really good way to kind of just quickly be like, oh, should the head be here? Should it be here? Kind of face it up here? Kind of face it down there? And you can just really effectively, efficiently, and quickly block this in. Because as I said, Loomis is doing this as a drawing from imagination, kind of thumbnailing or rough drawing tool. And I think what he would often do is like create some illustrations this way, but often this is a matter of creating a mock-up that you would send to a client for approval. And after that, then you would probably shoot proper photography and you would use that as sort of reference to create a high quality illustration. So it's primarily there as an exploration tool, and it's just a cool little trick that's part of a larger system of constructive anatomy that is about drawing the whole figure this way, of drawing everything in the world this way. And you can find similar systems for drawing the human form in Figure Drawing for All It's Worth, which is Loomis's sort of figure drawing book, or again, a lot of concept art, form drawing, stuff from industrial design, or there's systems for drawing animals and horses and all sorts of things using this same technique, where we just kind of start with primary forms, we break it down, we think about proportion. And once you do this, you can start playing with these things and it's really, really fun. So that's the real benefit that this is going to have. And I find the number one mistake people make with this is thinking that it's going to teach you anatomy or suddenly teach you a lot of these things. So often if your Loomis heads are failing, it's because you're missing other key concepts about drawing, perspective, constructive drawing, or you just don't actually know what the anatomy is. So you're kind of not really sure what you're trying to find or like when it would be right or wrong. So all these little marks that are put in are based off the skull and particular landmarks that we're trying to find. And if you don't really know why they're there or what's going on, it's really pointless to sort of put them in. So what we'll cover next before we sort of dive into some demos is, where this will really fail you and like what it's not going to do. So I'll talk about that. I'll do a bit of drawing and we'll look at, what this is not going to do for you and where you need to fill in the gaps in order to really get all of that benefit from it. Now, if you want a few examples of how you can construct different characters and design characters of different proportions, I've got an extra video that I'll link to down below that goes over that in way more detail. But let's look at the things that the Loomis method isn't going to give us. So the first is it's not going to teach us anatomy. It's also not going to teach us perspective. And it's not going to teach us form drawing. And these are all key things that we need in order to effectively use the Loomis method. So let's just go over the basic concepts here. And after this, I'll dive into exactly how to find the different planes of this sphere, because that's one of the first things. So if we think about perspective, the first thing that this is not going to teach you is like, how to find the center. That's really critical, right? It doesn't really talk about the nuances of what's actually going on there. So if you're kind of struggling to draw these kind of ellipses in the first place, or you don't really understand how to find dimensionality of a sphere, which is one of the harder things to do, then this isn't going to help you. And the other thing is that often when we create these anatomical sketches, is that we kind of practice this without perspective. So often we use a very sort of isometric perspective where, as I said, you kind of practice this going like 1, 2, 3, and you can almost like draw this with a ruler, right? This is super useful because this is how we learn. We're doing our little studies and I'm like, cool, yep, got it. I'm doing this thing. I got this line, right? Now I'm doing this, and now I can just, like kind of draw a line there and like, boom, I've kind of got a face that looks sort of okay. Which is good, right? Like this in itself is useful, but it's not necessarily going to relate to how you would think about these proportions in perspective, because that's just sort of using this grid, right? And that's easy. But often what happens is that we actually have more perspective, which is where even if you're just sort of drawing a face, often what you have is some type of grid, right? Where these lines are actually going to a vanishing point. And this means that even when you're just constructing a standard three-quarter view, what you have to think about, as we'll sort of touch on, is how do I draw this ellipse properly? How do I draw these other ellipses properly? And how do I think about the foreshortening, right? Because now it's a lot harder to figure out, like, where is that hairline, and how do I sort of draw it and make sure I measure, and like, where do I even measure from, right? I've got my first proportion here, then I'm like, okay, should I visually do that? Like, it feels like horizon line is sort of lower here. So, yeah, where does that actually go? And then, yeah, like, should this one be... Yeah, it's kind of tricky, right? So we often, if we don't understand perspective, you can do a pretty good job of like drawing the Loomis method, but it's going to look wrong. Like, it's going to look weird because we don't have all of these different elements sorted in our mind. And this is where I see most people kind of trip up, is that, yeah, like the idea of breaking things down and building out the forms with the Loomis method is pretty intuitive. You can try it a few times and then you'll be like, that sort of works. But yeah, if you don't understand and these are connected, the form drawing and the perspective, then yeah, it's tricky to kind of draw things that look reasonable or kind of realistic, right? Things will often look sort of static, and you can practice your Loomis heads without a lot of this perspective, and they'll look okay. But often when you then go and try and apply this and draw it like on a torso, it's going to be a lot more challenging. So that's the first thing to understand, is like, you need to know, if you want to draw these in perspective, you need to know a bit of perspective, how these different lines within an organic form are converging to a vanishing point, where your horizon line is, how to guesstimate or think about finding the different proportions in 3 dimensions, right? Like even this, where I'm trying to find the center line and track the center line across like a moving sort of form, right? These things are non-trivial, right? Drawing like and finding some of these forms, that we would sort of maybe look at next, some of these rhythms. Yeah. This is quite challenging. So I think often what happens is people get into this and they're like, oh, I can't draw a face. It says hard. Maybe the Loomis method will save me. Like, it is not going to save you if you don't understand some basic concepts of perspective, which is why, like, it's actually a fairly advanced technique and a thing to use. And while it's worth practicing, yeah, you need to practice it in context. So hopefully that makes sense. And linked to that is, I guess, form drawing. And what this means is similar to what I've been doing here. Often what I'm doing is drawing with form. So I'm finding these cross contour lines. I'm thinking about the dimensionality. I'm thinking about this form in 3-dimensional space, right? And I'm tracking it in 3-dimensional space. And when I'm, finding these different markers, I'm drawing with form, right? I'm thinking about, where's that mound of the mouth, right? Let's find some dimensionality of it. Right, let's think about where the line of the mouth is going to be. Let's build some lips on top of that. Let's think about where the philtrum is, right? Like, let's add some different elements of structure on top of that. So if I kind of don't know where half of this stuff is meant to go, and I'm not used to form drawing or drawing with construction, then it can be really challenging to get the most out of this, because you need some of that at least to just start with the sphere. Because even though it seems very approachable, the sphere and the circle and cutting it up is actually part of constructive anatomy. So the last thing that this won't actually give you, which I think is often a major misconception and is why I keep repeating it, is that this won't teach you anatomy. So if I sort of think about what it's going to give me, right? If I just sort of follow the Loomis method and I go, okay, I've got that line, right? And again, let's think about adding at least a tiny amount of perspective here, right? Got that line up there, right? And I'm sort of trying to figure out, okay, if I was viewing it from the front, right, where is that hairline? But now that I'm viewing it up, like from below, like where's the hairline now? Well, that's kind of hard to find. So I've sort of got to guesstimate that. And then I got to find, where that proportion would be mirrored and duplicated down below. And this isn't no longer going to nicely line up with my front-on sphere. So I'm actually having to do a lot of this construction, this form drawing, and yeah, trying to guess where all these different bits and pieces are. But to go back to the anatomy thing, yeah, like this is going to give me some of the basic stuff. And you might think like, okay, if I can kind of get here, then I'm home and hosed, right? Because this is the hard bit. This isn't actually the hard bit. Like even if you can even if you can get to that point, the next question is like, well, what do all these markers indicate? And how do I think about where the forehead, for instance, is going to be narrower versus the back of the head, right? Like, where are these cheekbones? Right? Like, in which proportional marker, right, are the cheekbones, right? Like, how do I construct the nose, right? Like, how is a nose constructed in 3 dimensions? Right? Like, what is the actual anatomy of the nose? What are the subtler forms of the nose? Where does it connect? Where does it connect to the mound of the mouth? Where are the teeth under here? Where's the difference between the teeth and the lips? Right? So there's so many of these different elements here that you're going to have to find out and figure out. And the Loomis method just doesn't really give you most of those things. It's like a pretty basic kind of set. But once you understand the anatomy, you can kind of see, well, right, yeah, the cheekbones are, at the bottom, right, of this third proportion, right? They're kind of like here. This is sort of where the cheekbone marks are. This is why, Loomis kind of says to put them here. I'll just make sure I lean over and I'm actually getting this a little bit in perspective. And yeah, like where is the line of the jaw? Where does the jaw change direction? How do all these rhythm lines actually interact with everything? So until we sort of know this, you can draw your nice sort of Loomis construction, but it's only going to give you a rough idea of where things block in. Now, if you're just drawing from observation, like that might be fine. But yeah, if you're really genuinely trying to draw the whole thing from your imagination, that's going to be challenging. So you need to understand that you need to understand the anatomy to whatever degree with your style you need to. And that can include understanding, exactly what the forms of the nose and the mouth are going to be, right? Like how to project the nose off the face, like what are all the different planes of the face, all of these different little details. Like we need to understand that in detail as well. And once you do, then you understand that, look, the Loomis method is giving me, as we've touched on, most of what I need to block this in. But once you're there, you're the one who's going to have to add all the detail. You're going to have to figure out the secondary forms. What are the planes of the head? What's happening underneath everything with the skull? Right? Is this a masculine face? Is it a feminine face? Right? Does this have different proportions? So a huge amount of drawing is understanding these other proportional markers, all the different anatomy. And again, this could be for you understanding it at a really sort of deep level. It could be just understanding the primary forms if you have a more sort of stylized look. But yeah, the Loomis method is a way to deploy the anatomy that you do have, and so that you can actually sort of put it to use and figure out how to block in that initial form. But it's not really going to tell you where to put the eyes or how to think about the form of the underbrow, right? It's not going to teach you where the different rhythm lines are. That's different stuff. And you need to know both. So again, just a quick, I guess, point there that I think is often misconstrued as that, this is like Loomis's anatomy. And it's not really anatomy. And this is, if you look at the book, it's just one little chapter and thing in a much larger book that's meant to go through a lot of other anatomical advice. So firstly, let's understand that. just to reiterate, here we have a lot of these primary forms that you're going to need. So we kind of stop with a lot of the basic Loomis method that we were sort of talking about. And the rest of this book is not more of this. It's just basic anatomy. And it's this is a great anatomy book. But again, it's talking about all the stuff that we need to know, such as what's happening with the teeth, what's happening with the noses, what's happening with the eyes. Let's think about breaking down the primary forms of the head. How do we think about the planes of the face? How do we break those down? How do we memorize those? How do the ears work, right? Like all of this stuff, right? Like a huge amount of drawing and getting good at anatomy and visual library is being able to break down all these forms into different angles. But you see, like we're not really talking about the Loomis method anymore. We're just sort of looking at how to draw, like what are the planes of the face? How do you break those down? So this is like fundamental, is that like, yes, we can use this to create all sorts of different types of proportion, and he's done some good examples of that. But fundamentally, you also need to know like what goes there, right? Like what are all the different little bits and pieces? How do all these kind of proportions function? When you combine that with the ability to draw it from different angles, yeah, that's where the magic happens. Now, I thought what I'd do is go over probably one of the biggest challenges here, which is looking at the initial parts of that construction, which is actually defining dimensionality in the sphere. Because this is something that, look, you may not understand all of technical perspective by the end of this, but at least we can sort this out, and I'll talk about, if you do want to actually use this, how you can practice where these things go, and just think about starting yourself off in a much, much better place. But the key idea is that Loomis method is amazing. It's life-changing. I use it every day, but it's got nothing to do with anatomy. It's got nothing to do with perspective. It's got nothing to do with form drawing. And if you just kind of learn the basic idea, again, it's not going to teach you the stuff that's actually going to matter. You'll just have a very rough kind of face that's empty, right? That's roughly from the right perspective. And you're not going to know where everything else goes. And then, everything just kind of ends up being wobbly. Anyway. All right, so this may get a little bit technical, but I think this will make all the difference when it comes to understanding what's actually happening when we are defining dimensionality within the sphere. And you'll learn a couple of other things about perspective and ellipses in general, because everything comes down to this idea that when we're chopping off the side of this sphere, we're kind of creating an ellipse. An ellipse is a circle that you're viewing from an angle. And it's critical to understand that the angle that you view it from doesn't necessarily have 100% to do with what is kind of on the circle, and the angle of that ellipse will kind of change depending on where you sort of view it and where it's kind of angled at. So the angle of the ellipse and the way it kind of changes in 3 dimensions is related to how close it is to the center of vision in your perspective grid, and also, again, like where it is related in 3-dimensional space. So there's a couple of rules that are really good to understand with an ellipse. And again, an ellipse right? An ellipse is just a circle. So it's just a circle, but we're viewing it from an angle. Now the question is, what are the actual rules of an ellipse? Well, an ellipse is kind of symmetrical. When you view a circle from a different angle, what you notice is that it's always going to create an ellipse. An ellipse is symmetrical. But as we sort of change, you'll notice it's symmetrical over a very particular axis, right? So as I sort of move the ellipse like this and it's sort of changing, what we're trying to understand is like, how do I actually place this in space? Because there's truth to this. There's truth to the position of this, right? If I was to look at like linking something that is perpendicular to this ellipse, right? And I'm sort of moving this around in 3-dimensional space. Like as I move, I'm always getting an ellipse, but this thing is pointing in a different direction. And this is where we use toilet rolls or something like a cylinder as a basic understanding. What we're trying to think of is, as I move this ellipse, which is a circle but in perspective, how do the lines that relate to it, i.e. these lines that are the side of the cylinder, or you can imagine if there was like a rod just straight through the middle of it, right? If I put a rod straight through the middle of it and that was sort of sticking out, like how does this rotate? Because this is the key to everything. And I like to think of this as being like the axle of a wheel, or just this kind of center point of a circle, right? So just imagine that any circle you're trying to draw in perspective has this imaginary axle sticking all the way through it, and that exists in all time and space, and it's just kind of sitting there, except again, it's a construction line, so we don't necessarily see it. And this gives us a couple of key observations. When we think of an ellipse has a minor and a major axis. And this is similar to what I just said. It has a line going through it that we can think of as the axle of the wheel. So if I think about an ellipse that I draw, right, all of these ellipses are going to have a major axis, and that basically divides it along its longer dimension in half. And ideally, if these are drawn perfectly, these will be symmetrical. In 2 dimensions, right? It's essentially symmetrical. So this side and this side of our ellipse are identical. And this is the anatomy of ellipse. It's always true, right? It's just, that's something that is true about ellipses. And when we know what's true, we can then extrapolate that in perspective. Each ellipse also, in addition to its major axis, has a minor axis. The minor axis of an ellipse is also symmetrically placed so that if you have perfectly, as I have not 100% here, drawn this through the center, that each of these quarters of my ellipse will be identical. Right, all 4 quadrants of are identical in 2 dimensions, which is interesting and really cool. Sacred, mystical drawing geometry. What this means is that we can think of placing a couple of these different items. In particular, the minor axis is our friend, because it is essentially like that axle that's going all the way through our cylinder, right? So we can sort of think of the minor axis as being like this, right? It's always going to divide, right, no matter where I put it, right? It's a bit hard to kind of see, but yeah, it's always basically going to go all the way through and divide that ellipse in half. And these 2 sides are going to be symmetrical. Okay, why do we care about this? Why is this literally the thing that will change every single aspect of your drawing life? Well, firstly, if you want to draw cars and wheels, like this is your friend, right? This is it. But what we're essentially doing as we're dividing this sphere, and again, this is a tricky extrapolation to make, but think of it this way. What we're kind of doing, right, is sort of chopping. We're like, if you imagine you got a hole saw and kind of just drilled a hole, right, and out of it popped one of these, right? So if I sort of got my, right, if I've kind of got my, right, if I sort of drill a hole here, what I'm going to get is, right, like a cylinder, a toilet roll, right, that comes out. And either side of it, there's going to be, right, this little bulge. And what we're doing is we are cutting that off, right? So that then that comes off and is now over here. And we sort of have, yeah, our ellipse, and on the end of it is our little side of the sphere, right? So that's kind of what's happening. Now, again, it's a long way to go, but you need to be able to visualize these things in 3 dimensions, because this is a big part of construction and constructive anatomy. He's visualizing these things. Now, you only have to learn this once in your life, and once you learn it, it makes every single drawing you do after this infinitely easier, more fun, and less technical. So even though this seems technical, once you kind of get this, it's good. So we can also understand that if we took a slice of this sphere, right down the middle, we would also be drawing an ellipse on the same axis, and thus it would have the same angle. So a good way to think about this is, yeah, if I kind of have a little cylinder like this cylinder has a rod going all the way through it that is the minor axis of both ends of this cylinder. Again, let me know in the comments whether this is either fascinating or whether I've sort of lost you and you're like, screw you, dude. This is, I came to learn how to draw faces and I'm drawing toilet rolls. Yes, you are. So you can kind of think of like, yeah, any other ellipse or line that would be sort of placed around this is going to follow that same logic, right? It's going to, any other ellipse that I draw that has that same axis, right, is gonna line up with that minor axis. And this is how you would think about drawing a bottle, right? So if I think about drawing a bottle or some other sort of construction, right, I'm gonna think about the cross sections that it has, right? I'm gonna try and join them up. This is one of the best exercises you can do. I taught this in boot camp for ages, right? Just can we draw little vases? So just understand this is what's happening. Like if you get a bottle, if you get anything, right, and it's sort of going in and out and in and out, all those ellipses are essentially linked in relation to each other by the minor axis. And their major axes are also linked. What we need to understand is that if I think about where my sphere is in perspective, right, I'm going to think about, like, yeah, where is the grid? Right? Like, where is this sphere sitting in space? And if I can find it in space, and I can also find the far side of it, and draw the cylinder that's inside it, right, then that makes my life a lot easier. Because now I have way more information about the dimensionality of this sphere. Boom. And once I have more dimensionality about the sphere, then again I can find more dimensionality, right, and define more of it. One, right? Again, now I've got 1, 2, 3, 4. Boom. So the key is that when we're drawing this sphere, what we're doing is thinking about where do I actually chop the side off? Because depending on where I chop the side off, right, everything changes. And if I have a really thin little side that I chop off, then that's obviously as if I'm looking more front on. If I chop a lot off the side, then I'm looking more at the side of it. But the thing that you don't want to do is this, which is say, okay, I've got my sphere and I'm going to be drawing the line down, but then I'm going to draw the ellipse like this. Because this ellipse has a minor axis that's going here, and this is now out of line with the center line. So that's no longer nicely chopping off the side of it. Boom. So it's a long way to go to understand this basic concept, but just try and visualize as you're trying to find the space within your sphere, what's actually happening with either side. Now, the last thing I'll talk about is like how much to chop off. So firstly, understand that this is a guesstimate. What you're doing in general is just trying to create a skull-like proportion. So there's not really any defined amount, but if you want one, we can think about it like thus from the front. Right? So if you want to think about it from the front, here's my center, and here's my hairline roughly. Here's me mirroring that same proportion down. So from front, I basically chop, I chop a bit off the top and I chop the same amount off the bottom, and then I've got my proportions. Now, if I sort of, again, put that here, I'm going to have my chin. So how much do we chop off? Well, again, like a good way I would say to sort of think about it is like chop off 1/8 or 1/4 either side. So if you kind of divide this into 4, right? Again, from side to side, right? That's like probably a pretty good indication. And what I would also say is like probably if you want another little really simple thing is, yeah, kind of chop the same amount off the top and the bottom to get like a rough hairline and a good sense of proportion of where the nose would be, right? And again, if we sort of pull these lines down, right, and then I connect this up, this is going to give me, like, look, a pretty good indication. If you want another really simple abstraction, if I then take one of the lines in, i.e. halfway along my circle, and I pull this down from the chin, right, so we're going from chin to temple rhythm, right, so we're going down here, then this also will be your friend. This is like a good buddy of mine, the temple rhythm, which again wraps around, right, which is not what we're going into here, but like, yeah, it wraps around and sort of comes down the bottom here, right, near that sort of zygomatic bone down there. But that's a good way to think about it, right? If you're sitting there and you're a little bit more mathematically minded and you really want, like, look, just tell me like exactly how much to cut off, tell me exactly what to do. Yeah, like from the front, just practice this. Divide your sphere into 8 for each side. We chop off one of those, right? It's gone, right? It's now over here, discarded like a common bit of sphere. and then let's take another one, and that'll give us our sort of temple rhythm, right? Again, across the center. Because again, conveniently enough, the temple is going to be narrowest just around that top middle proportional marker. So again, does that tell you what to do from the side? Yeah, like you can get a feel for how to do this from the side. But if you just kind of practice this, it's going to give you a rough indication of like, look, how much should you create? And if you want a really simple tool, demo or exercise or sort of thing to try, yeah, just try and draw that sphere and see whether you can create some ellipses kind of going around it, right? And if you want to sort of take this further, like think about how this relates to other ellipses that relate to it. So drawing little bottles, drawing the sphere, finding the dimensionality of the sphere. But that's the basic idea. Anyway, hopefully that didn't take too long. But if you understand this, it'll level up all of your drawing, guaranteed. Now, I think the thing that we're often trying to do here, though, is look, how do I actually draw this silly Loomis form, which we've been talking about, But how do I do it in 3 dimensions from different angles? So that's what we'll look at next, is like, okay, how do I actually put this together? How do we think about drawing it from vastly different angles? And yeah, this way you can actually learn to apply this stuff. And after that, I'll talk a little bit more about how we need to actually learn anatomy to go to the next phase. Now, if you're enjoying this ultimate guide to the Loomis method, but you actually want to do some of these exercises that I'm talking about, or you want to refresh some of these concepts, I've actually built a more fleshed out version of this guide on the Drawing Codex, and the link to find it will be down below. Now, this is just going to include all the different sections here as their own little video. So if you want to relearn or refresh the anatomy of ellipse section, you can go check that out. If you want to watch one of the demos again, you can go check that out. And I've also got some screenshots there of it, all of the key takeaways from all of these different lessons. And yeah, just some better versions of all of the demo sheets that I've created. So if you want to get way more information here and repeat and do some of these exercises, check that out, as again, it'll just make this a much more accessible resource. You can also then rewatch any of this without ads on the Drawing Codex. Anyway, the link will be in the description. Go check it out. All right, let's draw some heads from different angles, and I'm still just going to use the basic, right? The basic male or female kind of head here. We won't go too crazy. All right, again, let's put a couple of different ones in here, and then we'll go for it. All right, so what we need to think about is like visually roughing this in, right? And again, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this when we get into the actual kind of epic demo here that I'm going to do, where I'll actually kind of show you how we do this, plus actually add some features. But yeah, it's okay to kind of sketch around. That's the first thing I'd say. Like when you're actually drawing and trying to figure this out, right? Like it's not that I'm always, nailing these ellipses on the first go, right? Like sometimes it takes me a while to kind of figure it out. But what I'm trying to do is kind of get here a feeling for like what angle is this center line on, and how does that relate to the side, right? So that's the first thing that I want to get through and understand, right? It's like feel out and using this center line that I'm drawing through, right, to get me a feel for, yeah, like where are all these different lines? And what I can do there is then figure out like where is this cross, right? So the reality though is often, like before I even do this, I often have like a pretty good idea of where and what I want my face to be. So this is the first thing to understand, is that like before you do anything, you probably are visualizing some kind of drawing, right? And that's where, like, yeah, you can do it, but try and think about like where do I want my face to be, right? The other thing to understand is that, yeah, I kind of have to drop straight down here, right? So I kind of have to think about, right, if I do cut the side off and I have my thing, I have my cylinder, I kind of need to think about like where does that, right, where does that face come down, right? And it needs to come down. I can't kind of draw it so that the line is going to come down at a strange angle, right? It kind of has to go down and be at an angle that makes sense. Now, again, part of what we're dealing with here is just thinking about a grid. So something that'll help is like, yeah, we kind of need to, do the Loomis method, but the more you can also, draw some grids and try and think about like where does this thing exist in 3 dimensions, right? Like where is everything? Like try and think about and visualize the grid. All right, again, let's go through that process again. Right here, and again, I'll do some different ways of sort of thinking about it. So again, here, if I'm like, well, right, I kind of want to draw, a thing where like, look, there's a guy's nose here, right? The chin's sort of down here, and maybe I kind of rough it in, and I'm like, cool, I sort of understand what I want to do. I still then would go in and true this up, right? And this is a fundamental thing that we need to think about. And I'll dive into this more, as I said, when we do the demo side of it. But yeah, what I'm trying to do here is think about, yeah, where is that center line through the middle now? How do I chop off the side, right? And then, like, where is the center of the sphere? And then, like, can I draw down, right? And can I find those markers? And then after that, can I find the grid, right? Like, can I find 1, 2, 3? Can I think about where the lines are going to go? And what you'll tend to find is, like, yeah, once you kind of find a grid, it's easier to visualize. So a lot of drawing is about finding one thing and then finding another thing. But once I found these things, yeah, what I would try and do in terms of like what I do, which is a little bit different to the typical Loomis method process, but I actually really like to connect up that tempo rhythm with the chin. I find that gives me a lot of the value and structure that I actually need, right? That allows me to just kind of connect the dots after that, right? And, right, this is where my nose would be. Again, we'll look at like how you would place these things in, because I'm just kind of being like, yeah, put the nose in there. Non-trivial. But what I'm trying to do is find the center line, right? Find the cheekbones, etc. Again, I'm looking at this one from a bit of a weird angle, so hopefully it doesn't look too bad. But yeah, like that's going to give me a lot of what I actually need, right? Boom. Okay, so with this one, again, I'm going to find, where have I got? Again, I'm thinking, and this is the tricky thing, is like now I'm drawing it from above and I'm trying to find these 1, right, 2 proportions. So I'm sort of thinking about like, okay, if I imagine I'm viewing it from this weird angle, right, like where is that hairline here? And I'm sort of trying to project out a line so that when I think about where my center line is, that I'm kind of defining this line. So if I think about from the side, what I'm sort of doing here, make sure that's drawn properly, right? What I'm kind of doing here is I'm thinking about, here's chopped off, here's halfway, right? And now I've kind of got, here's my middle proportion, right? Here's this one. And then like, where's this one? So I'm kind of projecting a line off where this hairline would be. Right? And I'm trying to think about, yeah, like where is this line in front of the face? That's sort of what we're trying to visualize, is like, yeah, where is this line in front of the face? Which is a weird thing to do. Again, the first few times you're doing it, you are probably going to be guessing, and that's fine as well. But often what this means is, yeah, when we foreshorten, we're going to be drawing stuff that feels a little bit counterintuitive, right? Like this is not necessarily going to feel like obvious or super intuitive. Because what I'm doing, right, is thinking about, okay, yeah, where's the mound of the mouth, right? If I had a nose, there might be a nose sticking out here, right? Then the nose is going to go and connect with the brow. Right, and again, if I sort of follow that around and think about that middle proportion, right, maybe I might have cheekbones going there, right? Again, allowing me to sort of start to visualize the mound of the mouth, right? Boom, 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 boom. Right, easy. And my, right, eyes are going to be somewhere under there. This comes down. Again, that's where the grid is, but the jaw often comes in a little bit, right? So this sort of comes in, right? And then I'm thinking about, yeah, if I kind of follow this line around, i.e. I think about where's my grid here, right? Where's my grid here? Yeah, I can sort of find that jaw, which is the tricky thing. So when you're drawing these up angles and you're like, oh, how do I do this? This sucks. Yeah, like a huge amount of it is a matter of finding these jaw lines, right? So we're trying to sort of look at this from below and be like, where are these guys? That's what I need. That one and that one in 3 dimensions. Right, so we kind of got that. Right, and then over here, yeah, maybe. Right, again, if you can sort of think about like what it looks like from that kind of angle. Right, so I'm like, yeah, maybe I'm going to see this one over here somewhere. Right, but the way that you would find it is guess, or just sort of draw a line straight across, right? I'm just drawing from here to here. And yeah, to a certain degree, if it's hard to find, like it might actually not matter. But again, that's where these are. For real people, we also have a huge amount of mass underneath here. So in addition to this, if I actually want to draw a real person, right, I'm not just going to draw this kind of bony nothing. We're going to come back, and then we're also going to have the voice box, which comes down here. Right, so here I've got, let's find the back of that skull, right, let's chop a bit of it off, right, think about where the spine would be, and then, you know, kind of encase the spine in a rough neck cylinder, right, let's think about where that voice box is going to be, and then I'm going to wrap the neck muscles around until we get to a point that, again, should still line up in perspective with a lot of these lines. Boom. And again, it's really good when you're practicing this to practice doing it with these extra anatomical bits and pieces in there, right? So if you practice the Loomis method with the neck muscles, like you're actually going to be able to draw this. Whereas, like, genuinely, if you don't, it's going to be quite challenging for you to really draw this properly, because it's never going to look right. It's always going to look wrong, right? This too is going to be sort of in shadow. So yeah, hopefully you get the idea. And again, I'm going to think about a rough rhythm around the face, right, hooking into the side of the mouth. Right, this gives me some of these markers, and right, if I shade that in, right, if we shade underneath the eye, shade underneath here, or shade underneath the top lip, right, this starts to give me that sort of form that I need. And again, I'm viewing it from the, right, from a weird angle, which I think is affecting the look of it a little bit. So if I kind of true it up, right, get it over here a bit more. So yeah, one of the challenges with drawing like this is that I'm looking at it from an angle where I'm not seeing it in proper sort of perspective. So often need to remember to just sort of check those proportions. Boom. Again, rough idea of how that would sort of work. Okay, let's try again with this one. Right. So I've got my middle proportion here. Right, I'm going to start, because where do you start? Like, what do we start with next? Right, I'm going to think about, yeah, where's this line going up the imaginary middle? Right, I've got 1, right, 2, 3. Again, they get slightly bigger based on sort of foreshortening. And I'm going to take that tempo rhythm and draw it down, because that gives me a little bit of truth. Let me start checking this in 3 dimensions properly so it doesn't look awkward. Right, here I've got some indication of underneath the brow. And here again, let's put in that mound of the mouth. Boom. All right. And then, again, I've got to think about where, right, here's my temple rhythm going down. But yeah, we've got to think about where does that jaw go. Again, what you often find is, yeah, with a lot of these angles, like when you're sort of looking up, right, unless you're really up, like it's hard to see both edges of those. Like often, yeah, we're kind of very close with these two lines. And so, yeah, you're not always going to find this far marker in 3 dimensions. But as I said, think about how we're going to go back that way, right, to find underneath the jaw, right, and boom, let me go down, just make sure this is trued up. Got those cheekbones. So a lot of the challenge that we're dealing with here is understanding, yeah, where are the cheekbones in relation to everything else? And this is where like your 3-dimensional anatomy becomes really critical, because what I'm trying to understand and visualize is where are these rounder forms, right? Like where is that zygomatic arch? Where does it go to? How do I sort of connect it up? Right, and again, I'm going to project the nose out here. Put that in there. And yeah, there again, we got like a rough idea of what is going on. Think about where my spine roughly is going to go. Let's wrap it in a rough cylinder. Draw a center line down, and then again in line with some of these perspective lines, I'm going to draw something that roughly approximates the clavicle. We can mass in that voice box, right? And then we can wrap, and again this neck is looking pretty long, wrap in those neck muscles, boom, boom, right? And the traps. Think about those other rhythms that may kind of help us. But as I said, like a big part of your success here is not the Loomis method. It's going to be understanding the subtle nuances of the anatomy and where the eye intersects with the zygomatic bone, right? Like underneath. This is what's going to give you all of your actual information. And if we can't understand how all these different forms work in 3 dimensions, then yeah, it doesn't really matter how good the Loomis method will get us with this sort of up view. So this up view is often like what everyone's trying to get from the Loomis method, but the real challenge is that unless we understand in detail like what's happening with all those anatomical markers, then there's really no point, right? Because where this will fail will just be in understanding the complexities of underneath the lips, right? Like how do the top lips and bottom lips go? You probably, it's not just that we don't know how to draw the face from that angle, but also probably you don't know how the nose looks from that angle, the lips look from that angle, the cheekbones look from that angle. So because of that, you can deploy the Loomis method, and it's just deploying our lack of understanding of more detailed anatomy. So, like this bit may even look okay, but, the more detail we add, the worse it gets, right? So hopefully that makes sense. But, this is how we, sort of deploy and understand this basic information here. Pretty simple. Cool. Anyway, this one looks a bit better than this one. I feel like, again, this one was a little bit weird. And again, you're seeing the limitations of like here, how, like where are the eyes? Like it's going to look weird if we don't have eyes, right? I don't have any of this other sort of information there. I'm not sort of indicating where the cheekbones are. So again, you know, that's always going to look a bit funny. So let's try a couple more, right? Let's try a couple of other sort of down ones, or slightly kind of down, because often, yeah, like you don't really need these crazy extremes half the time, right? And I'm just going for repetition here, so, you know, there's no, like, you can just watch this once and sort of get it, right? So I'll repeat this a bunch of times, and we'll go a bit faster, right? Because again, the trick is, once you sort of understand what's happening here, i.e. 1, 2, 3, right? And I'm like, yep, cool. What's happening with the perspective, right? Let's find that temple line. Let's find that other temple line. Let's draw this down. Let's guesstimate where that is. Let's put that in, right? Let's chop a bit of that off. Let's think about where that goes, right? So as I kind of think about, like, yeah, where's the bottom of that, right? Where's the bottom of that neck, right? Where's that clavicle? Right, yeah, I'm thinking about the perspective here. Right, where's that voice box? So yeah, like as I go through it a little bit faster, you can see that, you know, you get kind of pretty close to what you want relatively quickly. And also what I'm doing is, yeah, like roughing in some of these other proportional elements, right? Like the cheekbones. Right, again, we can wrap this around and find where the ears are going to be. Right, there's my temple line, there's this, right? Let's find center of that. Right, let's project out the nose, right? Let's draw the top of the nose. Got center line here, right? And now I've got the brow mass. Right, let's put in some eyeballs. So yeah, the more you get used to it, the faster you get, the easier it is. And you know, you start to understand the nuances, which is like, yeah, this temple is really, right, this temple is really narrow here, but as we go towards the back, right, we're going to see more of the mass of the brain casing and the skull. So we want to define this narrowness of the temple here. Right, but as we go out, right, we're going to go over here. And again, this character has, I think, what I'd consider pretty long face, right? But again, you can, like, you know, I can kind of change little bits of it. I can sort of move things around. It just gets me to the basics, right? Like the basics are kind of done, right? And this means I can think about, right, shading this underneath the nose here, right, boom, and again there would be many other elements that we would add. Boom. Bit hard to see this one, my hand's kind of over it. All right. And again, clavicle, right? Voice box is somewhere here, right? Draw down, find the center, right? Put some traps down, etc., etc. So again, the faster we go, the more we do, right? The easier it gets, the less you kind of worry about or think about all this kind of nonsense. Again, and if we, you know, think about, you know, doing a different type of character, right? Again, let's find this. Right, again, I got that. I got the center, right? I got the far one. Let's put a mark here, right? Find the temple, right? Let's draw down there, right? Let's draw this, right? Let's get that major sort of construction there. Again, you can do it that way. Like there's so many different ways to sort of do this. Once you get the basic proportions sorted, it becomes a lot easier to just kind of rough it in. Oh, those ellipses are not aligned. Right. Again, see if I can pull this down. Right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Right. Think about where that temple is. Right. Equidistant from the center. Right. Pull that down. Right. Let's think about this being maybe more of a sort of female, feminized kind of set of features. Right. So we'll duck this up a little bit more. Basically exactly the same stuff. And yeah, just keep in mind the grid, right? We want the grid everywhere. Oh, under the brow. Got this. Find center. Right. Got the nose here. Right. Lips. Lips here. So yeah, exactly the same stuff, just slightly different proportions. And this really is the trick, is that often with human faces and human proportions, it's not about like interesting characters is not about having some crazy different look or drastically different thing. It's often just like the devil is in the details, right? It's just a matter of figuring out how to add subtle variation. Right, so again, this got an ear here. Same thing, right? This goes back, right? Think about where that line is going to be. The neck is slightly smaller here. We have less visible voice box. Just make sure I'm drawing that right from the right angle. So yeah, here. Think about where that other jaw is. Put in some rough shading. Boom. So, same idea, slightly different, right? Sort of approach, different proportions, right? Different look. And obviously these are all weird anatomy people, right? Like this is not what people actually look like. People have hair and interesting features, and, you know, they actually have poses and emotions. And, you know, once you sort of add in all that, right, you know, you stop getting these kind of weird looking people. But yeah, you know, all I've done here is just slightly change and tweak the, right, those sort of proportions. And we now get a much more, you know, sort of feminized look. All right, same thing here, right? Let's do down. This will be the last one. And I'll just rough this in quickly. 1, 2, right? 1, 2, right? Right, let's draw in that mouth, find center, right? See if we can better define the brow ridge there. Again, think about like this rhythm. This is a really good rhythm to kind of remember, like what's happening here. All right, let's draw a nose on there. Boom, boom. Right. And yeah, here it's just a matter of proportion, feature changes, right? Subtleties. But yeah, let's think about where are those, right? Where are those cheekbones? But yeah, we're talking about like very, very kind of subtle changes will make all the difference, right? Again, where's my ear? Think about again, just softening those bits and pieces. Put in the bottom lip. Bit of shading, and yeah, away you go. I think probably this neck is a bit wrong. So yeah, I always like to visualize where that spine is coming out of. Right, that often keeps me honest in terms of where that actual neck is. And yeah, here we're just not going to have some of that other anatomy. So again, hopefully you get the idea there. It's the same thing, right? Same thing, slightly different features again and again and again. Once you sort of get used to it, right, it's just a matter of, very, very quickly drawing things, messing around, like having fun. And, you don't even have to draw in half of the stuff, right? So again, that's often where we're going, is like, it's not about, oh, you always have to draw with a whole bunch of lines. So look, to rough any face in, you're going to have to draw a bunch of lines. You're going to have to figure out where things go. You're going to have to do a bit of a sketch. Like, that's fine. The question is, which lines do you draw? How do you draw them? And, how does this stuff actually apply to your art? But yeah, keep practicing these things as like a little abstraction. But the reality is that you actually need to experiment. You need to play. You need to put hair on these characters and sort of figure out what's going on, because once you've done a couple of these, you're going to get the basic idea. What I want to talk about now, though, is the gap that you may be feeling between like being able to draw this sort of rough, simple kind of mannequin style figure, and then again, actually understanding like what's the difference between the male and the female view. Like, how do you masculinize or feminize features or presentation, right? Like, how do we create characters that feel as if they have a little bit more padding, or who are super cut or super lean? Because often, yeah, it's all about the details and the subtlety of what's actually going on, right? And the better you can understand that, the better everything's going to be. But hopefully this has given you an idea of like how to actually apply the Loomis method to create some different angles, which is what most people are wanting when they go looking after this system. The anatomy gap is often what's missing. And as we discussed, the Loomis method is primarily there to teach you primary form, pun intended. And the primary form is the largest shapes. These are your big masses. It's how you are easily able to manipulate things. So we can think of this as being like the arm is a cylinder, the head is a sphere, like all these kind of primary form breakdowns. But obviously anatomy is far more complicated than that, and there's a number of different levels that you can understand it. Firstly is understanding the écorché, or the muscle, or the skeletal system, and this is our medical grade anatomy, and this will be immensely valuable. So many of the marks that we put on, and so many of the things that stay consistent, even though people may have more flesh or more padding on their face, or get older or younger, there's a lot of these key markers that are going to stay the same because they're about the skull. And likewise, even though the facial muscles aren't always 100% related to what we see, understanding them can be critical. For instance, even though we have these weird muscles here that feel as if they are things we don't actually ever draw, understanding that they're there and that they're pulling the corners of the mouth will help you to place the mouth understand what's going on. Similarly, if you understand the anatomy of the eye, what's actually happening when people blink, which lid is the active lid, how to think about the structure of the ear, like how many bits of cartilage make up the nose, all this stuff that you kind of understand from looking at the muscle system and the more sort of medical grade anatomy is really, really useful. So understanding that will help you look, what do these lines mean? Like when we're finding this temple rhythm, when we're finding the center line, when we're finding the bottom of the nose, like what does that give us? What are the other elements there? How do we think about this? The second thing that obviously we need to understand is, what do these forms look like with subtlety, right? And there are a lot of these external elements of anatomy that really have nothing to do with muscle and nothing to do with bone. It's like a combination of everything and of the individual, right? And this is just all the little subtle things that happen with the face. And this will be drastically different depending on the style you choose. But yeah, obviously knowing what people look like on the exterior is critical, right? If you don't know this, then we don't really know why we're constructing that primary form. Now, the stuff that is in the middle is this type of planar surface. And this is often what we're looking at when we are artists, our sort of artist reference, the planes of the face, your Osaru heads. And this is something that will drastically help you to simplify what's going on. I talked about this in the Loomis book being a major thing. What are the actual planes of the face? How do we actually understand them? How do we break down all this sophisticated stuff and sort of just think about, look, okay, there's only like 3 major planes we need to look at with the lips. If we break down the eyes into these 3 sections as well, that really sort of helps us. And you can kind of just study how different lighting scenarios affect those primary forms. And it's really, really good to simplify things in that way. So there's normally 3 different levels of anatomy that are really useful to you, and they're all going to do different things. And the Loomis method primarily is just there to help you place the big shapes in a bit more of a planar fashion. So it kind of exists in this artist-focused anatomy world where it's trying to help us manipulate large forms in 3 dimensions using constructive anatomy. It leads very nicely onto the planes of the face, but it doesn't really teach us like the subtle nuances of how the nostrils function, of what happens with different expressions as the corners of the mouth move, or it doesn't really teach us what's happening underneath, right? Because it really is just about drawing the head. So you need to flesh out all of these elements of your anatomical knowledge, of the face, of the body, of whatever you want to draw, in order to do it properly. But it's often really tricky to do any of this until you actually place all of those primary forms there. So hopefully that just gives you a rough indication of like what I mean by like the anatomy gap. This is what you have to learn, is like, what actual shape is the nose? How do you actually break down the eye? What are the different planes of the mouth? How on earth do you actually remember to draw all the different little bits of an ear, right? That's anatomy, you know, and that's a visual library. The Loomis method helps us get there. So what I want to do next is a slightly bigger demo where I'll just sort of draw one head, but we'll try and combine all of these concepts together and look at walking you through adding some of this extra detail, the different planes of the face, how it all sort of connects together. And we'll kind of start building up a little bit with the skeleton and understanding where some of these muscles are. Okay, so let's take all those anatomical concepts, the planar nature of the face, the musculature, and also all of the fine details, and see if we can construct a face using the Loomis method, but then talk about how we apply everything else on top. So I'm going to do this in Photoshop because it allows me to just iterate a little bit faster, and this way I won't run into any angle problems where I'm viewing this from the wrong angle when I'm sort of sketching. So what we're going to do is begin by defining dimensionality within the sphere. And we'll just draw a fairly generic head here, but I'm thinking of the horizon line being a little bit lower than the eye line. So maybe the horizon line is, yeah, sort of somewhere over here. And what that means is I need to, visualize the dimensionality that's happening within this sphere. And we're going to be viewing at it from this angle, and I'm going to have some different rough perspective lines going this way. So I'm trying to find that ellipse to chop the side off. And as we discussed, I'm visualizing this extra stuff that you probably don't need to draw in every time. But you can see there, I'm trying to visualize that little cylinder, right, within that sphere. And I'm also trying to visualize, right, I have a rough idea of where that center is going to be, but I'm also trying to visualize this as an ellipse that runs through the sphere, but also, is kind of symmetrical across that line. Now, again, you can just guesstimate all of these things, but this will help you quite a bit when it comes to planning it out. And I'm just treating all these verticals as if they are actual verticals. They're not sort of converging or going to into any perspective. But I am going to try and find some of these additional markers. So we're thinking about the Loomis method as being this division where we have, 8 different proportional markers going across, right? And we're chopping off 1, right? Chopping off 2, but then I'm trying to find this kind of tempo rhythm. And that gives me this nice sense of where that sort of tempo is. Now, this is just the beginning. And often, I guess, what we want to do is rush, right, to finding the overall sort of structure of the face. But what you kind of find is once you understand how a lot of these different systems are functioning, you kind of realize you don't need to rush to find all those, right? I don't need to rush to find the chin, to find the jaw, but let's do that anyway. Because there's actually other more important structural elements, such as the brow, that probably are better off sort of coming next. But I think often with the Loomis method, what we're trying to do is construct that initial dimension. So the way that I like to do that is to figure out where that jawline is going. So if you think about having like a line going underneath your jaw, that's sort of what I'm trying to find out. And I'm always drawing across and trying to reinforce that grid. So here, I'm going to have that middle proportion, and I'm sort of roughing that in. But something I find really useful is to just carry, think about how wide the jaw is going to be for your particular individual, which could be very wide, or it could be just sort of more of a pointy chin. And I'm going to pull these temple rhythm lines through and try and connect up with the chin. And this is actually a construction that you'll see Loomis sort of doing. And I'm going to, again, think about the actual jaw coming forward, right? Coming forward at an angle from the, line that would just be sort of dropped down. So if you imagine, right, if you kind of just dropped a line from the middle of your head, right, and it had something heavy on it, it would just fall with gravity. That's kind of this line, right? The jaw comes in a little bit from that. And I'm just going to pick a nice place for it to change direction. And that gives me a lot of what we would consider to be the Loomis method. Now, what you typically see is that when Loomis goes to the next phase, he's like, cool, right, I've got this bit, which is the critical thing, and I've blocked in the primary form of the face. What's next? Well, what's next is the next critical primary forms. And if we're just talking about the face, this is actually, the brow, under the brow, and thinking about where those cheekbones go, right? So if we can kind of think about where the cheekbones are in relation to everything else, and which marks we're putting in, and how they're relating to the cheekbones, then this can give us a lot of information. I'm actually going to put in the neck here though, because I feel like this will help us visualize what's going on. So I'm just drawing a line to represent the spine, and then I'm sort of just wrapping it in a rough cylinder. I'm then also sort of visualizing the space between the bottom of the chin and sort of where that clavicle is, right? You can sort of think about your clavicle, right? Sort of where your neck muscles kind of connect in the bottom, right? And we can sort of draw a nice center line down there to where that sort of clavicle will be, right? Roughly. And again, exactly where it is in relation to everything else is going to change depending on the posture of the character, etc. But yeah, I find this can really help us to just organize everything in the beginning. And right, we're just going to put in a few of those other marks, such as the trapezius muscles, etc. Now, again, let's make sure as we put in all these lines that we're going with our grid, right? As in, right, all of these lines are, right, converging to a vanishing point. All right. So the Loomis method exists in this perspective space. And if we don't understand what's happening with the rest of the space, it's hard to just sort of put these features in. So this primary form construction is actually one of the simpler things about using one of these systems like the Loomis method. The real trick is like, how do we draw a face around that? And how do we add some of the extra details, right? So I've got a rough indication of where that sort of voice box is going to be. Got some of these neck muscles going here. And again, this is all rough so far. Boom. And what I'm going to look at next is just placing in the main features, which is going to be the mouth. So I'm finding the mound of the mouth, or the barrel of the mouth, which lies over the dental arch. And this is roughly going to be halfway between our lower proportion that houses the mouth, again, roughly. And I'm also going to try and understand and find the bottom of the nose, which is like pretty easy. And now that I have tried to carve out a bit of this under brow area, and this is like a really important wedge to find, right? Like just under the brow. And you see Loomis sort of finding this and roughly sort of placing in these forms. But again, we need to have like a bit of a better system and a way to understand that. So this is where understanding some of the anatomy underneath can be really useful. So what we often have is that this temple rhythm kind of turns into the zygomatic bone, right? Which is that sort of cheekbone essentially. And that's actually going to, connect with the face and the skull much lower down, like down sort of near the bottom of your nose, right? Like that's where that zygomatic bone is going to go roughly. And you're probably better off thinking of it lower than you imagine, right? And then I've got my eye sockets are going to be here, right? I've got my nasal bone that is here. And underneath that, I'm going to have the nasal cavity, right? So again, this is stuff that we're visualizing, but we know we need to find if you want to sort of add those secondary forms. And the Loomis method doesn't provide those, right? It just gives us that primary form. But we can use constructive anatomy to build upon it. So what we're sort of after is that the ridge that sort of runs along the edge of your zygomatic bone, that the form of your forehead and your brow kind of rests on, right? So that means that essentially we often have this brow and this forehead, right? This temple area that's a little bit more sort of pinched in. And then we sort of have the mass of the cheeks, right? That sits on top of that. Now, again, I'm going to exaggerate this so it's sort of clear, but this gives us that skull line, right? Then we sort of move down to represent that under the brow area. right? And then we sort of go out with the cheekbone. Then often we're going to, right, maybe mirror some of the undulations of the mouth. You're going to hit the chin, right, come back up, and then we sort of got the jaw, right? And this gives us like a rough indication of what's there. So with that as a rough understanding, I can now go in and, start to place some of these other features. And we're doing this at a pretty high fidelity. What I'll do next is show you how I would actually use this for much smaller characters and when I'm actually sort of drawing comics and things. But let's just place in some of these ancillary structures, right? I'm going to put in a rough square with two triangles either side, or this sort of trapezoid shape for the upper lip. Right, I'm going to place in another sort of box for the lower lip. We're going to slowly build this form. I'm going to think about like, where does this top of the nose come down? Right, and how do I think about drawing that underplane of the nose? Again, because my horizon line is at the chin, I probably am going to see underneath the nose there. Right, so we can again block this out in a planar way, right? I can define some of the extra planar features of the brow, and this is starting to give us like a good indication of where some of those primary forms of the face are using sort of constructive anatomy. Right, I've got a rough indication of the nose there, but also if I put in some of the wings of the nose, right, as a rough form, right, I'm going to get pretty close to having those forms that I need. And if we sort of follow this along and I draw through, then I can probably find out like where is that tear duct on the other side, right, of the skull, and then I can use that to help me draw the eyes. Now, we won't go all the way and actually sort of render this out. I'm just going to do this in planar fashion. But the rest is about understanding anatomy, which is a much bigger video. And this is the critical thing to understand about the Loomis method, right? Is like, it's going to give us some great information about anatomy, but mostly that primary form, right? If you don't know what comes next, right, and we don't have a good understanding of how these different forms wrap around the face, then it becomes very hard to do this next phase. Well, we're going to locate the ear that I'm just going to sort of block in as roughly existing within that middle proportion. Right, place that in. And here we have a weird looking anatomy individual. That is a good basis for us to add some extra additional anatomical stuff. But we can use this as a basis for some of these extra rhythms linked to, again, our quote unquote Riley style rhythms. Right? And this starts to block in the rest of those features. Super, super useful. It just kind of organizes things, right? Like gives us a nice sense of like, oh, okay, now I can kind of see where all these other features are going to land. You can start to much more easily place these once you have that. And again, what you need to do is understand all of the different anatomical elements that go on top of this. And understanding what's happening there with the bones will really help you also render the form. Right? Understanding where the eye socket is, right, and some of these other rhythms as well that are really useful. I find is this one. So we sort of go under the nose, and we kind of find that right this little rhythm here that just again it's just something that you tend to see as a really good delineation of where the form is. So we're kind of almost finding right this area, which we'll often see where the the zygomatic bones that sort of wrap around the side are gonna start to kind of pick up some light, right? So again, we're sort of looking at the structure there. Oh, again, this is super rough. And then we need to understand, yeah, like, on top of that weird skeletal structure, right, there's probably going to be a little bit of mass underneath the jaw, right? And if you put that in, right, and especially, again, if we sort of understand how that relates to the sort of voice box mass, then we're going to start to get something that feels a lot more cohesive. And so once you put all those things together, you start to get something that actually, looks a little bit more coherent and consistent. But the only way that you'll understand how to add these things in is through going beyond the Loomis method, looking at the other elements of the Loomis book, understanding some of the anatomy that's going on underneath, understanding some of the anatomy that's going on at the planar level, like how do we sort of simplify this? And yeah, once you do that, I'll see whether I can. All right, we'll pick a. All right, very simple. Let's go down here. Once you do that, it becomes a lot easier to go through and add some of these extra shading bits and pieces. So here, right, I can start putting in shading on this side of the character. Again, very simple. Right, I've got different rhythms that we can use. I've got different planes now. Boom. All right, let's shade underneath the nose. Let's think about our light coming from this direction. All right, so we're going to have shading underneath the brow here. And this person also doesn't have much eyebrow, which I'd say, yeah, everyone always looks weird, if they sort of don't have eyebrows. It's just something that's fundamental. So we kind of easily often take those things for granted. And yeah, maybe we could have a bit of shading as well, like underneath here. Maybe the side of the lip is in shadow. Right? Maybe we can continue and understand, like, okay, we have these planar structures, but I also understand what's happening underneath with the muscles, right? So I can add a bit of extra shading here and there. And yeah, a lot of this becomes sort of paint by numbers once you understand where all these forms are, right? I can start trying to push that, and let's think about, yeah, if light's coming from here, we're probably going to have some of this in shadow. All right. Boom. Now, the biggest challenge with this, as I keep saying, is that when you're doing these studies, we kind of have like this weird anatomy man here, right? Who just looks super weird, super generic. And this is really good to make sure you understand the structure, right? Like, yeah, like make sure you understand the structure, what's going on. But this is like the antithesis of what we actually want half the time. So while it's kind of often impressive and, you can see lots of people who get really good at doing these, like, this is probably not what your favorite artists are actually doing, but it's doing a good representation of how you might learn what they're doing, and also a lot of what they might be thinking. So a big part of like anatomy and constructive anatomy is understanding that this teaches us to hold that information in our mind of like what is happening with all these different forms. And it gives us an understanding of, as I draw an eye, I might be thinking of a lot of these planar facets. As I'm trying to indicate something with maybe just a black and white line and color style, yeah, I might have a much better understanding of what's going on with the form. And so then, yeah, it's a lot easier for me to just go and put it in, right? But ultimately, what you need to do is figure out like how this thing applies to your style, how it applies to the type of art you actually want to make, which of these marks and anatomical bits and pieces you actually need to employ, and how the Loomis head is going to be used in your process. Because when we're often doing and learning these anatomical exercises with the Loomis method, we're kind of starting as I did, which is like from nothing, and I'm just drawing a head for no reason, and it kind of has this fairly static look. And that by itself is weird because people often don't just kind of sit there like a deer in the headlights. So it just kind of looks weird. There's no illustration here, right? Like we often don't even have a functioning tonal plan or something that we can, right, sort of reference against. So yeah, it often just looks really static. So if you're doing these exercises and you're like, yeah, look, I kind of get it. Like I'm doing okay at this. But you notice that this doesn't really apply to your style, and it doesn't look good either. From my experience, that's why, right? Like, I can do this all day, but I'm like, this thing looks silly, right? So it's measured in terms of your ability to learn and your ability to take this information and go to the next stage, which is apply it to your style, which is what we're going to talk about next. The reason the application is important is that depending on what you're doing, you're going to probably use the Loomis method differently. That is to say, it's going to fit into your process in a different way. For instance, if I'm doing concept design, like you can see here, frequently I am actually literally just drawing these 3/4 heads. This is what I get paid to do. It's just draw different heads. And sometimes like this, they're not necessarily based on accurate human proportions. We're trying to stylize, we're trying to exaggerate. And sometimes you do a weird little sketch like this, where I just I think I kind of drew this helmet first in a couple of concept shots of this guy. And then I kind of just drew the eyes later, and they had this weird cat-like vibe, but it kind of was interesting. So I just tried to go with that and figure out how to design that. But the key is that when we're doing this, we're often starting with that 3/4 view. I can construct as I have with that previous demo, and then extrapolate, change the lips, change the nose, change the ears, change the eyes, and I can just explore with form. And this is the same if you are doing that type of work with figures. So often the way that I would use the Loomis method is I construct a figure and then I build the primary forms of the face, but it's pretty standard, right? This is just me creating little characters like this. And sometimes I will have a existing little thumbnail sketch that I can kind of put on top of more detail. But either way, with concept design, mostly you're just drawing these kind of 3/4 views if you're doing character design, and you can kind of just start. And also, in some ways, you're exploring, you're pushing form, you're exaggerating. And what we get paid to do is just push the forms, play around, mess around. And that's very different to if I was drawing comics, for example. Because if I'm drawing comics, I'm going to use exactly this system, but I have to match a pre-existing sketch or little thumbnail that I've done. So I still find a lot of these things valuable, and they're probably more valuable than if I was just doing concept design. But the way I'm going to use it is slightly different. So here I've got some examples of the Pinocchio book that I created. And for this, what I'm often starting with is a little sketch. that says, hey, I need Geppetto to be from this angle. I need to have the angle of the face from below. And what I'm trying to do is use the Loomis method to help me block that in. And so with every one of these drawings, I have a pre-existing little thumbnail sketch that kind of tells me what I'm doing. And I have to match not just that angle, because it often needs to fit in a particular spot, but I need to connect it to a body, and it has to have the right emotion. So I'm less using it as a way to explore form, expand form, and it becomes much more about this technical production style work. And I still use that with my little Pinocchio character as well. So all of these systems that I use are still going to be the same if I'm drawing the fox or the cat or Pinocchio. I still block it in the same because it helps me find the primary form. So you can really think of this as just a matter of finding primary form for your characters. So we've got some pages from the R of Fantasy book that I created, and yeah, it's the same. Even with this weird creature, I'm still blocking it out the same. It's just a matter of modifying the proportions, changing things, and that's where this becomes so powerful. So with every one of these different drawings, I'm blocking it out, but I need to make sure that the character feels right. So this is normally how that is going to work. And this is a slightly different approach. So what would happen if I'm trying to draw little Pinocchio is that, yeah, I probably start with a little sort of gesture sketch, right, of like what Pinocchio is doing. And I'm like, oh, he's kind of, right, his kind of eyes here, right? And I'm trying to sketch around and sort of find, right, some little way of sort of representing this little beat. But it may be even more challenging than that, because I may have to fit this within a little frame. And I can explore, right, and kind of say, well, maybe it would be better if his right face was up here, right? Oh, maybe I need to make his, right, this a little bit smaller. Maybe I need to change this. Maybe I need to move that, right? So we often have this sketch phase, but often we actually, before that, have an even more restrictive little thumbnail where I might kind of say, hey, right, I need Pinocchio's face going up this way, right? He's kind of looking up and he's got a balloon. And so what I need to do is flesh this out. So often what happens, the TLDR there is that often what happens is that we have a pre-structural phase where I'm trying to find the sketch and the gesture and the emotion of the character. And this often isn't done with me sitting there going like, okay, where's my equal proportions? It's just done very roughly. So let's take a quicker look at that, right? Often what I'm going to be doing, as I said, is trying to be loose. And as we're loose, when it comes to drawing, right, I'm going to often make mistakes. I'm going to be rougher, because the primary thing that I'm after here is not perfect structure. It's just making sure Pinocchio has the right feeling. And often when we focus on feeling, we focus a little bit less on structure. So I'm often going to be messing around, right? I'm playing around. I'm thinking about, look, like what could be the right pose for this? And the process of me doing this, where I'm trying to find it out, but I have like infinite scope to be like, you know what, actually, like this would be a better, right? Maybe this would be a better pose, you know? This is often where if I'm just kind of sketching around and thumbnailing and trying to find like a cool pose for something, yeah, you can, right? I can mess around. I can explore. I've got all the time in the world, and I can think about, hey, you know, maybe it would be good if it was like this, or, right? Actually, you know, again, maybe I need this. Maybe I need this to be, his nose to be going up here. Right, it's like it's whatever, right? Like whatever I want, right? Again, I have freedom. I'm gesture. I'm sort of sketching. It's different from this, where I start with like a pretty important frame for what to do. Where, yeah, Pinocchio's got to be here. I've got to have text balloon here, and he's got to be explicitly looking, right, in the right direction. And then I've got to make sure that I execute this drawing properly. right? Again, maybe he's sort of clasping something in his hands, right? So I've got my little sketch, and my goal with the Loomis method is to true up this sketch, but as I've said, it often starts here, so I don't really get to choose where I put it. And the same thing when we're doing this. So often that means that the way I would use this, and again, this is just a super simple Pinocchio. So we sort of look at how we would use this same sort of constructive anatomy here, and then I'll do the same with some human characters. But the way you're going to feel about constructing your character and the freedom you sort of have drastically changes depending on how you have to put it. Like here, I'm very restricted. Here, yeah, I'm sort of restricted, but I also have like a pretty good understanding of where everything needs to go. And then once I've got a clear picture of like where everything needs to go, now I can start to construct. And this is where it's important to get that Loomis method has nothing to do with anything really. It's just a really cool system for constructive anatomy. And we use the same constructive anatomy techniques for everything. Drawing horses, drawing cars, drawing planes. It's just a structured way of thinking about the, right, where are we? Got an elbow here. Yeah, it's just a structured way of thinking about what's going on. But here, I'm going to draw through. Right, and I'm going to think, okay, where is Pinocchio's nose? Right, it's down the bottom. Almost, I divide his sphere, which is in his face, really, literally is a sphere. But I'm going to do the same. I'm going to be like, okay, where is that nose? Right, let me find that position, and I've sort of got 1, 2, 3 equal proportions here, and then I'm going to draw out his nose. And then I'm going to put his eye on that same line, and then his mouth sort of exists in this weird latent drawing space, right? So you can see here that like this is a very different way of thinking about the drawing and how you draw versus me doing, right? If I had to do 100 Pinocchio iterations, right? Because I'm going to start with the sphere. I'm kind of like, oh, this is real comfy, right? I can find the center line. Whereas here, often what I'm trying to do, right, is I'm trying to get the right expression. And I'm trying to match it so that, like, look, I need to make sure his nose goes where I want, because that's what the story's about. And again, I'm going to have my little, like, word balloon up here, and I want it to feel as if, right, he's saying something. And so that's often what we're doing when we're creating illustrations or little sort of comic book panels, right? And I'm using the Loomis method to place and find those different features, to find center line, to place the nose, etc., etc. And again, I've talked about this on the channel quite a bit. I'm also, as you'll notice, finding a lot of the rhythms of wood on his face. So if I have this, it's a very similar process, except I'm really locked in, right? And I got to think about, okay, how do I accurately find this face? So again, same as that one, right? Like, can I draw this consistently? Can I get the same thing happening? Right, so I'm trying to place that point where his nose is. I'm trying to think about where his eyes are. Right, and I'm like, yeah, where is that coming out? Right, where is his body underneath everything? Right, where is this going? Right, again, I'm just going to draw these hands and things gesturally, because this is not a hand drawing ultimate guide. But yeah, that's kind of what we're thinking about. I'm like, yeah, I've got the same Loomis method stuff. I'm finding the same dimension, but here, and you can see, like, once I sort of get that, like, it's very easy for me to go through and now structurally put everything in, because I have that system, right? I know how those different lines go, and as soon as I construct all of these different bits, it's really just going to fall into place, right? Now again, here I could maybe try, again, like adding more sort of emotion to it, right? Boom, boom, boom. So hopefully that makes sense that, and this seems like, look, this is the same thing we're doing, right? It's the same thing. It's like, dude, what are you talking about? Just go try it. Go try like learning it where you're sort of drawing in the 3/4 view and then try and apply it to what you want to do. It could be character design. Well, like, yes, you draw it in 3/4 point of view, but you're really looking at like, how do I expand or like change the proportions? But yeah, if you're drawing comics, often like you kind of already know where things go. And so you sort of have to use like these simple versions of the construction that you've got to place the face. And then you need to know like, how do I sort of add detail to that? So let's do one last demo where we deal with a couple of drawing challenges where we start with a sketch, and I'll just walk you through the process for how you think about roughing in using the Loomis method, but then also finishing and cleaning up using the Loomis method. As I said, often when we're dealing with drawing and roughing things in, we kind of start with a very rough little idea. And this can literally just be like, hey, I got a character here talking. And then often we progress to saying, all right, like who is this character and where are they sort of facing? But still, often at this point, what I'm trying to do is use the Loomis method or some form of constructive anatomy to actually place this character in here properly. So what might be happening is character is, right, looking up. So again, I might have some sense of like, hey, character's looking up. But what I'm going to try and do now is just roughly sort of use the Loomis method or some type of construction or sort of rough version. I'm using my rough sort of version of it, right, to kind of put in some sort of little storyboard, right? And I'm going to think like, hey, yeah, here we got my character, right? But it can look a bit derpy. Why? Because I might also want to be like, nah, you know what? Like let's draw it from this side. So this is where often, I'm having to like, I'm having to sort of flesh this out, but I'm still using that basic same concept that I find quite useful, which is start with the sphere. Let's place it in. And the reason that this will be useful is you can see there, I haven't quite placed that face properly. But if I sort of think about, right, where is my skull, right? Like, where is my spine? How do I sort of connect to that sphere? I can just kind of place the mass of the skull in a pretty good position. And then I can, by just putting in that side ellipse, I can actually place, right, like this. I can go like, okay, maybe it would be good to have the character again like that as I had, or we sort of go back, right? I can, right, place it to the side. Now, again, this is loose, right? Like this is rough. This is like not kind of finished, but I'm still using that mass of the primary form of the Loomis method to sort of rough that in, because this gives me a feeling for what's going to happen. So what this often means is that with the Loomis method, we kind of have a couple of different, right, sort of angles that we're trying to deal with, right? And this is like the typical one, right, that everyone dislikes, and often we sort of imagine, hey, I need the Loomis method to help me deal with this upshot, right? Here I've got like some character and they're looking up, similar to what I had with Pinocchio, right? But I got this sort of rough, sketchy thing that I sort of fill in. And then the next sort of challenge I have is to essentially kind of solve that, right? To make that more detailed. So if we, right, duplicate that over, still got my weird anatomy going on the left here, right? So if we sort of take these, We duplicate. Oh, I'll do a different one there. Right, if we kind of erase that and think about, yeah, let's think of like another, typical thing that people are often wanting to sort of deal with, which is, yeah, like how do we sort of draw a character looking down, right? So again, what I'm trying to do is draw a rough sphere, and I'm sort of going loose, right? I'm not trying to be tight here, because again, characters looking at something in their hands. Yeah, like I'm not trying to be tight, because that often just stiffens you up, right? And if I focus too much on drawing here, I lose seconds. And if you're storyboarding, like if you've ever done any proper storyboarding, you kind of know that, yeah, if you spend another minute on every drawing, by the end of the day, you've basically blown hours and hours and hours of your sort of existence, right? So this is often what we're dealing with, right? Is I'm like, yeah, I've kind of got this rough idea of where I want things are. Now, the better you get, right, the better this rough version is, right? It could be sort of very rough like this. It could be maybe a little bit better, but it still has some sort of sense of emotion. And my goal is to go in there and flesh these out. And this is like a very different way of thinking about it, because now I have, as with the Pinocchio, right, I have this drawing problem to solve. And this is a lot of what we do when we're actually drawing comic books or sort of illustration in production. But here, right, I need to think about, right, all those things that we've discussed. Right, I need to think about, yeah, where is this ellipse actually existing in three-dimensional space? Make that eraser a bit smaller so I can actually use it. Right, I need to think about, where is that center line? Like, where is that brow? Like, oh, maybe it's over here. Right. But I can't just change the script here. I can't just modify where the character is sitting. So it becomes a little bit more like a Sudoku puzzle, right? And I need to think about the perspective. So here I've got, right, the side cut off. Here I would have that sort of temple rhythm. Here I've got where my brow is, and I'm going to draw, right, my line down. Be like, yeah, okay, like up here somewhere is my first proportion. Here's my second, right? Here's my third, because we've got some sort of foreshortening going on. Right, so I've got these different bits and pieces happening, and yeah, I'm going to try and connect it up. All right, I'm going to find this major front plane of the face, as I said, same as we did before. And this will probably look pretty weird. Next, I'm going to try and find the, right, try and find the side of the jaw here. Because if you remember our sort of skull, right, I need to find those different little corners. So I've got my temple, right? I've got this, and I can visualize somewhat where, if I sort of think about where that spine is sort of connecting, somewhere here, we can sort of draw that down. And yeah, I can encase that in a neck as a rough thing, right? We can visualize the neck, and I can think about, where is that clavicle, right? Because if I want to draw all this other stuff, doesn't matter whether I can draw the face, right? If you can't draw the face connected to the neck in this view, like, just doesn't matter, right? It's not important. It's like, cool. Thanks for playing, but no. All right, so I've got center line, and here I'm going to build out the important structures of the neck, right? Those elements of that voice box. I've got these muscles. So even though, again, I'm meant to be drawing face and character, the thing that's going to allow me to succeed here is actually putting in all this other stuff. Because once I do that, then I've actually got a hope. Okay, so next I'm going to find the mound of the mouth. right? And again, this is me diverging from the Loomis because basically at this point, I've done the Loomis method and still it's not going to help me. It's not going to help you draw this angle. It's like, yeah, cool. You can sort of do this, right? Again, you can even put in some of these ancillary rhythms, which I think can be sort of very useful. But we then at this point need to actually think about, okay, but where is this mass of the brow? How do we sort of construct that? How do we find the center line there? Again, like where's the center line and where's our mouth going to be? Right. And I need to think about, okay, now I know where the nose is going to be. All right, let's draw the bottom of the nose. Let's trace out and draw the wings of the nose. Let's connect that up here. So I've got this kind of boxy shape. Let's draw up from the side wings of the nose. This gives me roughly my tear ducts. I can put in a rough indication then of where those eyes, the eyeballs go, which again is how big they are is going to depend on so many things, right? Including like how big the actual individual is. And this is where, yeah, like now I've got to refine things because it's no longer just a theoretical face. It starts to become a real face, right? With real form. And I've got real elements of structure there, right? And again, I can carry the top, right? I can arc around here to find out where, right, roughly where the ear would go. All right, so I got that. I got the back of the head. All right, I've got under here. Again, good to kind of flesh that out because, you know, that's not going to be it's no longer going to be like this big sort of chunky flat plane under there. You know, this is going to have some shading to it, right? But yeah, at this point, I'm like, yeah, look, most of this is there now, right? Like, again, how wide is the mouth? Let's put in, right? Let's find some of these other rhythms, right? Chin there, right? We've got, again, our sort of Rayleigh rhythm to here. We've got our Rayleigh rhythm to the corner of the mouth, which is also a really interesting rhythm. And we've got our rhythms going around the mouth, right? This kind of major emotional fold. And, you know, at that point, I'm like, yeah, cool, right? Now we've got our character, but it still doesn't have a lot of character, right? It's still a bit stiff. It's still a bit rough, but you know, this is that first step is like, okay, now I've got something to build on, right? Like now I can draw an actual character from this angle, but still even like transitioning from this type of like anatomy character to a real one is gonna take time. But yeah, and the more we sort of put in, right, these different features, depending on where your character's anatomy normally lives, right? Is their upper lip significantly bigger or smaller than the bottom lip, right? Like what's actually happening? All those things become pretty critical to sort of understand at this phase because we can do all of that blocking out right here. Boom. So that's how we kind of start to begin to solve those problems. And it's the same thing here, right? We'll do this last one. And yeah, let me know in the comments whether this kind of helps. Right. So here again, I'm gonna start. And again, you don't have to start with the sphere because what you find is actually like visually with the sphere, like the Loomis method is again a good way to sort of block in that primary form and sort of find it. But you may find that it's a little bit easier here to think about the three proportions, right? And then draw the sphere around that. Because all I need is those set proportions that I had. So you may find that you need to either draw the actual skull mass Loomis sphere a few times to kind of get it to be right. People often make it a little bit too small. But either way, yeah, I'm going to find that center line. Right, I'm gonna pull this down, but yeah, but this one I'll maybe make like a slightly different character. I know that this character is gonna have a longer jaw, right? So we'll just, right, now that I've got that, I'm gonna put in slightly different proportional markers. Right, here's my nose. I'm gonna rough it in. I've got my temple line, right? I've got my center line. Here's where the jaw ends. I'm gonna take from the temple line down. Now I've got a nice kind of long, broad chin. Right, I find the jaw there, carry it over. Again, we don't see it much, but it's often just these little bits on the side that kind of make so much of that perspective work. I'm going to find the mound of the mouth. Right, again, find the center. This gives me what I need. Right, and again, here it may be less visible and less obvious that we need to find this brow, but it's actually pretty important. And here's where a lot of these rhythms really help, right? Like finding these rhythms gives us a real good sense of what's happening with the side of the face, right? These little bunk, right? These dimensionalities are critical for finding that dimensionality. All right, so here, again, I'm just going to draw and find where I think that nose is going to be, right? The tip of the nose, I'm sort of measuring it from where the middle of the lip is going to be, and we'll just pull this nose down, right? And again, here I've got like a pretty good indication of the nose. Now, do I need this? Like, I don't know, maybe I could just wing it from here. And actually the mouth might be better for me to just, draw in as a single line. Maybe I don't need that to be some crazy structural thing, right? Based on my style. Right, I can draw in the top lids. But this character is a little bit older. They've got more sort of hooded, lidded eyes. So actually, right, we find that those upper eyelid folds go over. I'm not even going to draw the bottom eyelid because it's just not critical here for this particular style. Right, I fill that in. And now I'm going to try and get, right, like how do I get the emotion to be right? So a lot of the time when you're actually kind of drawing comic books, I have a particular emotion in mind for the character. And so, yes, like I need to place this in, like now I've got like such good center line, right? If this was a bigger drawing and I needed to put in the upper lip, right, I would have a really good sort of sense of structure for how to do it. But, maybe I don't. And likewise, if I need to put in some of those rhythms, I now have a good indication of where they would be. Right? I can flesh everything out. And the Loomis method and a lot of these other constructive anatomy techniques are giving me the structure that I need to do this. Again, if I carry around that proportion of the middle to the ear, and I've got that, then yeah, like we're pretty much home and hosed, right? I'm on the home stretch, right? Again, I think about where that clavicle is going to be, right? If I want to mass in the voice box, right? This might help me find some dimensionality under there. I might try and think about, indicating, that there's some sort of flesh, especially as he's sort of looking down. Again, I might need to put in some of those other little markers, right? I might need to restate, right, the temple line, restate the boom, restate the cheekbones, and yeah, then put in the hair so it doesn't look like a weird anatomy character. And once we've done this, again, like, the drawing becomes more and more solved. So The Loomis method in many ways becomes like a very good teaching tool for yourself to understand how to block things in. And it's really good for, as I said, to be able to block in these heads in the first place, right? You can see that by just blocking in the sphere, right, placing it in the right spot, I'm going to get like a nice indication of where all these features should go. And it's also giving me the scaffolding as that sort of primary form to go in and, add all that other stuff. Right. And now I can add any little bits of character that, I might have, right? Add my sort of features, et cetera, et cetera. And you could do this much simpler, right? Like you don't have to put in all this stuff. You can obviously, once you get good at this, just understand where to leave it, where to focus on other things. But yeah, that's typically kind of how we're doing it. So I accidentally erased that one. But yeah, you see the difference. So here we have, right, the sketch, right, this bit, and see if I can make this a little bit darker. Yeah, there we go. Boom. This is often what we start with, and this is maybe what we need. Again, if you have a rough drawing like this, it's really tricky to figure out like how to find all those different forms, but using the Loomis method makes it possible. But just understand those different modalities, because when you are trying to apply this stuff to concept art, or you're just sketching in your sketchbook, or you're actually learning and trying to be like, okay, I'm going to get all these features correct, versus when you're actually drawing a comic book and the frame exists, versus when you're sketching and trying to find a cool pose, but the frame doesn't exist. Like, these are different skills. These are different applications of the technique. And what you'll find is you need to actually practice them and see which bits of this system apply to you and your art. Anyway, that's what we've got time for in this particular very long and in-depth episode. Let me know if this one helped you out. I've been wanting to create a longer sort of ultimate guide like this to the Loomis method for quite some time, and I finally got around to it. So yeah, if you like this longer, more in-depth format, like, subscribe, leave me a comment, sort of fight the algorithm. Let me know that this kind of helped you out. I'd be really keen to sort of hear what you think. And if you do want to sort of take this to a new level, you actually want to try some of these exercises, revisit any of these concepts, check out the upgraded, enhanced version of this with a lot of key takeaways on the Drawing Codex. Again, you'll find a link to it down below. You just put in your email, you go straight through to that page. And again, you'll be able to see a much more sort of detailed version of all the things I'm talking about. I've got better photos and screenshots of all the different exercises and takeaways. All the videos are kind of separated. And yeah, it'll just be a much, much better version of this guide. And yeah, you can watch it there without all the ads as well. So if you want to figure out how to go to the next phase and actually kind of paint some of these things and sort of render them up, check out this video where I draw Ryu and then paint him with this simple round brush. We go over a lot of the same concepts about how to construct it, but most of that video is about how to do the rendering in a digital software, thinking about the color and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to take the Loomis method and actually add detail to it, check out that video. Other than that, we'll catch you around. Happy drawing.